so that we have the same starting point on this important topic. And then we'll bring in our four youth peace builders, and they get to ask their questions. And then towards the end of the seminar, we'll open up for questions from you guys here in the room and everyone on Zoom. And, you know, hybrid seminars, they're always a bit not necessarily tricky, but I want you to know, everyone who's online, we have our amazing intern here, Axel. He's taking care of you, so you'll be heard. Any questions you have, just ask right in the chat. So yes, let's get started.
Great.
So nice to be here with everyone.
Well, and may I say also, yes, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me, Maria. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to those online. It's a pleasure to be here at the FUF. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me as well. So first of all, so to kind of get that starting point, what would you say about, like, the topic today is the situation we see in the world today, where democracy is in regression worldwide.
Yes.
Could you describe a bit, from your perspective and based on your research, what is it that you see? What's the trend?
Sure.
And yeah, where are we at?
Sure. Great. Well, thank you. It's always hard to, with a question like that, well, where are we now and how did we get here, to know how far back to go, right? And so I'll just sort of speak generally. So historians have looked at the way democracy advances, but also recedes or reverses sort of in waves. There's periods of time where it seems to march forward and then periods of time where it seems to go back. And so from about 1974 to like about 2006, there was what we call the third democratic wave. It started slowly at first in the 70s, and it really picked up in the mid-1980s, late 1980s. And by the 1990s, you had over half the countries in the world, or around half the countries, a little more, that were considered democratic to some extent or another, that were sort of, if you had to label them, you'd say they're more democratic than not. It's a huge growth of democracy. And it started to kind of decline in the 1990s, but still sort of picked up. You had some important democratic movements in Serbia in 2000, Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2004. But now we look back and we say, you know, around 2005 or 6 is kind of when we started with an autocratic wave, or the democracy started to reverse. And that has been the case ever since. So around 2006 is when I start counting this. So it's 17 years, where now we have growing autocracy. And during that time, there's been a few things that have happened. The first is that we've seen it in democracies. Democracies have been what we call backsliding, right? They're becoming a bit less democratic. And some of them are actually a lot less democratic. So even the democracies that have been around for a long time and people thought they were solid and stable, they're actually showing signs of regressing or becoming less democratic. Another thing we've seen during that time is that autocratic governments, or dictators, have become more organized and generally more powerful, right? So if you look, for example, at a country like China, the Chinese government is more repressive, more autocratic today than it was 20 years ago. And it's also more powerful than now than it was 20 years ago. So just on like sort of big picture, this is, you know, a few sort of ways we can make sense of the world. And I think the question now is, what's going to swing things back in the democratic direction? It is, for those of us who do work on democracy and human rights, it's a tough time. And we need to push to reverse things. And I think we can. So.
Right, thank you. And so this is a big question, but in just short, could you say what was it? What would you say has caused this change in 2005, 2006? What were like the triggers?
Well, I think, I mean, there's a bunch of things, but I'll try to keep it simple. I'll point to I'll try to keep it to like 2 things. So one thing that happened is that the autocrats and more dictators in the world, people who are more dictatorial, the governments that were, they did become a lot more organized. They got very scared by the way that democracy expanded in the 1990s. And particularly around 2000, you had revolutions actually in Europe, right? In Serbia in 2000, Slobodan Milosevic, who was wanted, in The Hague, was his dictatorship was ended by a nonviolent movement, a popular nonviolent movement led by young people. And then, in Ukraine in 2004, for example, that really scared dictators. And they started organizing a lot more and saying, we're going to make sure that we stop movements from rising up and challenging us again. And they started to coordinate with each other a lot more on that. And instead of just reacting, they started to become more aggressive and, let's say, proactive, like pushing more actively to stop it. So that's one thing. But I think the other thing is that democracies have not always done a great job of delivering for their citizens. Particularly, you see signs where there's major wealth inequality and income inequality in democracies, where you create a class of people who start to feel that democracy simply isn't working for them. And when that continues for decades, and they're not really seeing a lot of accountability and they're not seeing a lot of change, a lot of times people start to say, like, the system needs to change. And I mean, I'm giving very simplified, terms here, but when people decide the system needs to change, politicians will say, yeah, it should change this way, or it should change that way. And you have a class of politicians that has come up and said, yeah, we need to the problem is we need to get rid of this, and this. And they try to take them on that direction. It's not just, by the way, sort of poor people at all. I'm not trying to blame them for democratic backsliding at all. But that's one, I think, when democracies don't perform, it does sometimes for certain people, for some people, create the perception that, okay, we need to change, and then they try to change it in a way that actually might not be very helpful in the long term. Yeah.
All right. So since 2005, 2006, and how would you say the international community has responded? In what way has it been efficient and inefficient to to kind of go along with these changes? And I'm thinking about intergovernmental organizations and what role have they played?
Yeah. So I talked a little bit about how, like, during the third democratic wave, it moved really slowly at first and then it moved fast. It's kind of been that way with this autocratic wave. So if we say it started in around 2006, it moved slowly at first. In 2010, people were having debates. Is democracy going back, or what's the trend now? We're not sure. And even 2012, 2013, a lot of debates about whether autocracy was rising or how much. It moved slowly at first. But in the last 5 years, it started to move really fast. And I think when things move slowly in general, people say, look, it's moving slowly. Let's take care of something that seems more urgent. Right? There's a crisis over there. There's a war over here. There's this, there's that. There's always urgent things to take care of. So whether you're talking about climate change or the state of democracy around the world, it's hard to trigger people to action on these slow trends until they get really bad. Unfortunately, it's really bad now. And I think now there is much more very important discussion among both governments as well as non-governmental organizations, and just among sort of public citizens everywhere, where they say, like, authoritarianism is not solving itself. This problem is not going away unless we deal with it. And we need strategies to deal with it. So I take that as a good sign. But I mean, it is true, a lot of damage has been done. A lot of people have suffered as a result of this trend.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. So it's been a bit passive, really, because it's not been taken seriously.
Yeah, and you can see it at the global level, and you can also see it in countries that are democratically backsliding. The democratic backsliding happens just slowly enough that sometimes societies have a hard time pushing back, because there's not just one big thing that happens where they're like, oh, we have to do something about it. By the time that happens, sometimes it's pretty late in the process.
Right. Thank you. So what would you say are the biggest threats then to this development?
The biggest threats.
Yeah, in terms of like
how can we push back
climate change. No, like we see this trend.
Oh,
and
what's it going to lead to?
Yeah, exactly. Ooh. Worst case.
Hopefully, we'll get to some good news. I do think there is good news, but I mean, if we're gonna, I think so a more authoritarian world, we know from research is going to lead to a bunch of things that are going to be pretty bad and that are going to affect all of us, and that I think we can do a lot to try to reverse. But if this trend continues, we are very likely to see more violent conflict in the world. We're much more likely to see violent conflict between countries, war, and we're more likely to see civil war as well in countries. We're more likely to see humanitarian crises. We are more likely to see more transnational or global criminal activity, as well as violent, what we call non-state actors. We're more likely to see more corruption. We're more likely to see more attacks on democracies, attempts to weaken democracies from within by corruption, particularly misinformation. We're also more likely to see actually just military attacks on democracy. We saw it in Ukraine. We see China threatening Taiwan. Unfortunately, the reality is like a more authoritarian world is actually quite a dangerous world. And it's something that I think democracies need to really wake up to. My democracy, my country, the United States, being geographically isolated from so much of the rest of the world, sometimes it's easy to think that we have this like extra insulation from it. I hope people don't think that way because, we are just as vulnerable. And so we have to take it very seriously. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I want to get into your research, the research you do on nonviolent civil resistance movements, and how you found that that's the most powerful driver of democratic change. It has been over the last century.
Yes.
So, first of all, how do you define such movements that we all understand what we're talking about, and also why are they so important for democratic change?
Sure. Yeah, I mean the research I draw from is done. I mean, there's been a huge growth of research in nonviolent movements, and I'll define that in a second, over the last 10 or 20 years. And it's really exciting. We understand a lot better now how movements challenge dictators, how they try to advance accountability, how they, work on environmental causes, how they deal with human rights, women's rights, labor rights. There's like been a lot of research on these topics, which is really exciting. And one thing that hasn't happened, though, is that research has not really crossed over into policymaking that much. It's sort of stayed more known by academics, and also actually activists have been reading it, but not so much policymakers. So I recently co-authored a report that tries to take some of this research. The report is called Fostering a Fourth Democratic Wave, a handbook, a playbook for countering the authoritarian threat. It tries to take this research and actually make it relevant to policy and say, if we accept this research, then what does this tell us about what we should do for policy? Now, the topic is nonviolent movements. So here are two kind of definitions. So nonviolent movements engage in acts of civil resistance. These are nonviolent actions where people don't threaten or use violence, but where they do things that they're not supposed to do or not required to do, or they're forbidden from doing. So protesting is an example. Doing a nonviolent blockade is an example. In authoritarian countries, it might be something much more low risk or subtle, like displaying certain symbols, but doing things that they're not supposed to do or illegal to do. Another thing they do is what we call acts of omission, where people refuse to do things that they're supposed to do or expected to do. So a consumer boycott is an act of omission. I'm going to not buy from a certain company to send a message to them. A labor strike, a work slowdown, divestment, pulling money out of banks, refusing to pay your utility bills, lots and lots of different ways that people can change their behavior patterns in that way. And actually, when they do it in a strategic way, they can really exert quite a lot of pressure, even against pretty powerful autocrats. So that's sort of the technique of action that they use. And then a movement for me, because the word movement is used a lot now. And it has a lot of different meanings. You hear politicians talking about a movement. Sometimes you hear corporations talking about a movement, or journalists say it. For me, it has a very specific meaning. And so a movement is sort of a way that people, often ordinary people, again, try to get social, economic, or political change. It persists over time. A movement isn't just like a quick uprising, a quick hashtag that then declines. It persists over time. It depends on lots of participation. It depends on ordinary people saying, I'm going to join this. I'm going to do it. It's not just an organization. It's people who say, I'm going to join this protest. I want to join this strike. I want to do this. People who may not be active in politics normally coming out and joining. And the movement has sort of 4 different things it does. The first thing it does is it puts issues on the public agenda, issues that people don't know about or aren't talking about. It forces people to look at them and talk about them. So it alerts people. The second thing it does is it educates people. It often will bring people back into the political process, people who have left it, people who are like, we don't want a part of that, or we don't feel powerful. Joining a movement is sort of an educational process about how to become powerful, again, as a political force. The third thing it does, it serves people's needs. Some movements might try to serve people's economic needs by offering certain economic services, but they all serve people's psychological needs. Movements are like communities. People find friends there, they find meaning, they find hope, they find power. Those are actual needs that get served. And the last thing movements do is they mobilize people, right? They get them out to do actions. So that's what I mean when I say a nonviolent movement or a civil resistance movement. It's the merging of movements and then a certain kind of action that exerts political or economic pressure.
Thank you. It's very clear. So I read what your research part of it, and what you also write is that the success rate of these movements has declined.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. And I want to give credit to the researchers on whose work I'm drawing, because I am not an academic or scholar. I draw a lot on scholarship, but I am not the core researcher. So I'm referencing research. So a lot of research in this field is done by someone named Erica Chenoweth, Maria Steffen, Jonathan Pinkney. There are many really great scholars who have done research that make it possible for me to write this kind of work. But yeah, some findings that a number of researchers have found is that, first of all, historically, nonviolent movements have been actually much more effective at getting governments to change than violent insurgencies, right? If we look at like 120 years of data, 1900 to 2019, one of the big findings is that your average nonviolent movement that was trying to get some kind of major government transition achieved its goals 51% of the time, whereas your average violent insurgency or violent movement achieved its goals 26% of the time. And then after that happens, the nonviolent movements are also much more likely to lead to a democratic outcome, right? When a violent insurgency wins, it usually doesn't result in a democracy afterwards. When a nonviolent movement wins, it often does. And nothing's perfect, right? Movements lose, and sometimes movements win, but then there's no democracy afterwards. Nothing's perfect. But if you compare the different ways to get out of authoritarian government, nonviolent pressure from the bottom up does seem to be the most powerful way that happens. Like consistently, the research finds that. And to your question, what about declining success rates is very concerning. So movement success rates have been declining in recent decades. And so in the 1990s, your average nonviolent movement trying to get a change of government achieved its stated goals about 64, 65% of the time. It's like a really high percentage. That number has now dropped to about 34% of the time from 2010 to 2019. And part of why that is that dictators and governments have become much more aggressive about addressing movements. They become much more coordinated in responding to movements. They actually help each other try to squash movements in very specific ways. And movements also are doing some things that I think are not helping them. So there does seem to be, in some cases, too much relying on social media. There does seem to be too much relying sometimes on protest. Movements have also become, there have been more movements now that are accepting violence as part of what they do. than historically has happened in the last few decades. And overall, we have a lot more movements now than we did, but on average, they're actually smaller. So the average number of people publicly joining and participating in movements was about 2.7% of a country's population in the 1990s. It's now about 1.3%, right? And so again, credit to the researchers. I didn't do that. That's based on Erica Chenoweth's really excellent research. But autocrats have gotten more sophisticated and movements are having some challenges. And I think the good news is there are things that we can do to try to be helpful to improve movements' chances of success. Mm. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, that's interesting. So I'm thinking one thing I think is important that we keep with us during this seminar is that, well, we have a very broad audience. You all come from different backgrounds and you work with different things. And just, I know the Global Peace Hub participants the best, and I know that they all work with different things. Not everyone's involved in a movement, yeah, but they're all very engaged. And that's what all of you have in common as well. You want to see a change and you're willing to be a part of that change. I'm thinking, otherwise you'd not be here today. So it's a quick question to you, but also to kind of keep that perspective with us towards the end. How can a person who is willing to engage and want to contribute positively to change, how can you kind of become an agent of change and identify with being an agent of change?
Yeah.
How do you engage, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I mean, there are lots of great ways to make change, right? I'm just talking about one of them. So that's one. Two is, I think this sounds silly, but the question that I kind of ask people is, what are your superpowers? What do you naturally do well? What do you love to do? Is it research? Is it writing? Is it art? Is it public speaking? Is it building community? Is it organizing? What is it? Is it technology? Is it finance? Because we need people with all those skills and more. We really do. I have a very broad definition of activism. I don't think an activist is just someone who leads a protest. Many activists might have rarely protested at all. When we think about what is needed to make change in society, we realize we're up against like a really complex task. And it's a journey. And at different periods of time, you're going to need different skills, right? So for example, like sometimes movements to get established, they need folks who are really willing to take some risk and really willing to take a strong stand publicly, and that gets attention. That alerts people. That is really powerful. But then they need the rest of the community to come in too. And mobilizing that community, the people who do this really powerful action in the beginning may not be the same people who mobilize the community. And let's say that the issue of the movement is a certain kind of human right, and that becomes a national issue. There are people who need to organize in different communities around that issue, hold meetings in their houses or whatever. That's a different skill set. There's people who are going to need to argue the case in institutions, whether it's the parliament, whether it's the legal system, or wherever. We need to change the laws. That's a different kind of activism. And so I think there are lots of skills needed. There are lots of different kinds of people needed. And we need to see as different kinds of activists that we need each other. Sometimes people think that what I offer to the movement is the most important thing. What I offer to change, if only more people were like me, my skill is the most important. Your skill or what you do might be the most important at one time. But over the journey, you're going to need others. And at some other point, someone else may need to lead even more than you. And so I think when we understand that, when we see that, we can breathe a little bit and say, okay, I'm going to find my places where I'm at my best. And I'm going to try to surround myself with others who, as this change evolves, can also play leading roles, and we can work together.
Great. So now we know what to do. So yeah, perfect. I think we should bring in our young peace builders. So Lana, Aya, Nathaly, and Abhishek, you can raise your hands, and Axel will, yeah.
Yeah, I think they can just
welcome you to speak. We'll it would be great if you have a stable internet connection, because that's a recurring issue with this network. If your internet connection is stable, it would be great if you also turn your camera on when you ask the question. If it's not stable enough, that's also fine.
Yeah, Nathaly, you can go ahead.
Yes. Good morning. It's morning here in Guatemala. So thank you for the presentation and the questions. And also, it's really interesting. Just to maybe give a little brief about myself. I'm based in Guatemala for the moment, and I work for a Swedish organization that work actually with human rights defenders that are using nonviolence methods. So I see it in practice, but I can also see like the limits of it. So that's why I'm also interested in more maybe based on questions of how do we create this democratic solidarity that you're speaking about? Like, how do we create this base that is active, putting maybe, for example, for what I feel from here in Guatemala is that it's hard to give an audience in Sweden about what is happening in Guatemala to make like this, create this solidarity, right? Like in the 70s, like the 80s. But also I see like the complication of when funds are shortened, like when we are getting reduced with funds of communication, this possibility of maybe being this link between Guatemala or Sweden or other countries also being reduced. And at the same time, this information is not being less. It's like we see it constantly, no? So maybe my question is more based on how do we create this democratic global solidarity with also when we also being shortened with funds, or how we as Swedes, I'm speaking as a Swede now, also being dependent on being financed by government, our own government, no? And now when we see this change, it's also like a cultural change of who do we look for funds. It's a long question. You know, I'm based in Latin America, and I learned that it's hard to be short here. So sorry, but yeah, it's more like maybe a reflection. But I think you could maybe, reflect back on it.
Oh, should I go?
Yes.
Nathaly, thank you for your question, and thanks for joining. I mean, so it's interesting. So the way that democracy and human rights support gets argued to governments like mine is often people say, well, democracy and human rights should be part of US values, and you say you care about them, and now you're not, so that seems so that seems hypocritical, or you should do this thing that is good for your values. And the people who are making foreign policy also are thinking, yes, but what about security cooperation? And yes, what about trade? And so what happens when those things are in tension is that people say, well, yes, democracy and human rights might be part of our values, but there's a higher value here for security or trade or whatever, and so we're going to pull back from democracy and human rights. Yes, we still care about them. We promise you we're still bringing them up with the government, and maybe they are. But this trade agreement is actually in the long term, we think it will help, or it's more important, or whatever the argument is. And so as a result, you see a lot of times hypocrisy, or what looks like hypocrisy. I think we need to change the argument, because for all the reasons I mentioned, authoritarianism is a global threat now. But it's not one we're going to win through war. Or if we think we're going to militarily defeat authoritarianism, we are unfortunately very mistaken. And we're not going to beat it just through diplomacy either. We're not going to beat it through sanctions by themselves either. We are going to beat it. Well, the people who are going to beat it are actually people in countries living under authoritarians. And those people are an enormous source of power globally. And if we can start to develop foreign policy where we recognize to deal with this threat, we actually need people in other countries. We think they need us. We actually need them. Our democracy policies do nothing if those people don't take charge of their country, which is very hard and high risk for them. But we need them. And if we flip that and sort of say, okay, so what does a foreign policy look like that recognizes that ordinary people in countries all over the world want democracy and human rights? How would that shift our policies? And by the way, it's not really optional, because I'm not arguing that we should help because it's part of our values. I'm arguing now that we should help because it's actually necessary to deal with something that's threatening us. If I have to make that argument, do it because it's in our self-interest, I will make it. And so I think that shift in the way some people in the foreign policy community are thinking is actually happening. It's happening slowly. We can say it's happening too late, but I do think it's starting to happen. Yeah.
That's positive.
Yeah.
Do you have a follow-up question, Nathaly?
No, not for now. So maybe I'll join in another question. Thank you.
I think Abhishek was next, so you can go ahead.
Hello. Thank you for the enlightening conversation which you had. I'm Abhishek. I'm a member of Global Peace, but I've also worked in India for furthering the rights of youth, particularly in decision making and policy making areas, working with government. So my question was being a devil's advocate, because this is how I think the conversation is happening in India, particularly, even though we have seen a kind of backsliding in democratic values, certainly in India across political parties. What is particularly concern for, I think I would say India, but also many countries in the global south, is that there's a lot of suspicion when it comes to support from external factors or external institutions and countries. And this there are so many reasons for it, because of the post-colonial, these are post-colonial states. They're very suspicious of these actors which try to influence policy making. And you mentioned with respect to a social movement. So one of the major challenge which we face, particularly in India, regarding social movements. There are a lot of social movements which have happened in the last 5 or 6 years, but is to kind of maintain the integrity of the social movements. And what happens in all these social movements starts with a very good cause, but eventually in the middle of it, what happens is that the states starts accusations, for example, with respect to fundings, financial aids, influence operations from external countries, and all these and the perception of these social movements starting to dilute, and the citizens, particularly citizens who, for example, the common citizens who are also kind of very supportive of these movements, start to question these movements when this challenge started rising regarding the support from external actors. So in this context, do you think that being supportive of these movements through financial aid, or in any other factor, would be a particularly positive movement? Because judging based on the last few years how the things are happening in India, even though the domestic challenges are so many, but there is a consensus within the country that even though we are facing some challenges, the fight should be within the country. That means the people should fight with the government or the citizens. But and whenever these external things comes, what happens is that even those common citizens who are against government, they started getting very suspicious of these movements. So I would say that there is a kind of a dangerous backfiring of this argument of support, particularly from global north. And this also happens, particularly, I'm saying this because we have seen, particularly under Trump administration, the kind of backsliding democracy which happened in US. There's always a fear that there's no consistent policy in US. Even for example, Democrats come with they have different policy with respect to democracy. Then Republicans come. Like most of the countries are right now looking at US. Though most of like particularly in Delhi, the conversation is like they don't know what is the future of the world because the kind of polarization which are happening in the US. So what would be your comment or take on this issue that we need to be very careful, particularly on the issue of external support, because particularly in South Asia, for example, where India lies, on one side there is Myanmar, there is political instability, civil war happening. On the other side there is Pakistan. On the south side there is Sri Lanka, which is going through turmoil. So it's very kind of very securitized area already, and whenever these kind of things happens, it becomes more securitized.
Great questions. I have a bunch of thoughts on this. The first one is to just remember what movements are doing, generally exercising universally recognized human rights. Protests, boycotts, strikes, they're not doing something that is like some secret program from some secret government. They are exercising their human rights. And I think that's really important. Governments, especially more autocratic governments, love to make the argument that there is some secret program that is externally supporting these movements. And now this is a security issue, and this is about our sovereignty, and now we have to protect it. And because it's a security threat, we can crack down on them with the military. Whoa. These are people in a society who are exercising their human rights because they're fed up. That's the case nearly always. Right? You can find examples where, yes, maybe there was a small group where they were paid, but when movements start getting big, it's not because there's some massive foreign operation. It's because it's touching on what people feel, right? And so, in Ukraine in 2004, the accusation was made, yes, the Orange Revolution, this must be a US operation. Yeah, really, like 100,000 Ukrainians are hanging out in Maidan Square in December and camping out at risk to their lives because they're all getting a paycheck. The stuff starts to sound ridiculous. And so it's really important for us to not immediately accept the framing of governments that want to delegitimize these movements. That's one. Second thing, on the topic of human rights, we all, as human beings, have a right called the right to freedom of association. One of the major human rights instruments globally is called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR. Article 22 of the ICCPR gives us the right to freedom of association. That means we can form groups to further our interests in society. And part of exercising that right is the right to request and receive resources. If you can form associations, but you can never raise $1, you can never get any resources, it's not really a right. So part of the right to be able to form associations is also the right to get resources for those associations. I can point you to UN Special Rapporteur reports on the right to freedom of association, where they are very clear. Those resources can come domestically or internationally. And they're not just money, it's a wide range of resources, information and others. There are restrictions under international human rights law on the right to freedom of association. They are vastly abused and overused and misinterpreted by autocratic and some democratic governments. Just because there are some restrictions on that right does not give them actual grounds to do the kinds of restrictions that they try to do. And so when they do that, they're actually violating the human rights of their own population. They're violating the rights of their own population's freedom of association. And, this is one area where, as someone in the United States allows a huge amount actually of foreign influence in our country. There's foreign contributions coming in, there's all kinds of stuff happening. And, sometimes it's tough, but and our democracy has been backsliding. No, I'm not going to say it's just because of foreign contributions. But democracies can usually handle it. Dictators are terrified of it. They love foreign military support. They love foreign corporate support. But when it comes to civil society support, they get very, very scared. And I think we need to call them out on it. That's two. And then I think in terms of sort of financing movements or supporting them financially, financial support is not the most important form of support for movements. In fact, financial support can sometimes be damaging. A lot of movements aren't set up to accept large amounts of money. If you give a movement a lot of money, you might create problems with people fighting about how to use it, for example, right? What seems to be the most important thing is actually knowledge, training, ideas. And to take your comment with India and the Indian independence movement gave a great gift to the world through people learning from that movement about nonviolent struggle, nonviolent action. In my own country, there were African American people in the 1930s and 40s that were traveling by ship from the United States all the way to India to learn what Gandhi was doing and to learn what that movement was doing and taking those lessons back to the United States and applying them. Thank God for that foreign influence. Another great organizer in the United States, Cesar Chavez. In 1965, he was trying to organize some of the poorest workers in the United States. He had a copy of Gandhi's autobiography that he kept with him and marked up and everything. And people say that he read it like it was a training manual. So that is the kind of thing that really helps movements is knowledge, strategy, understanding technique. And that's a lot of what these autocrats actually want to cut off is just the exchange even of ideas. They want to claim that if you even learn from social science or research or other movements, that that's foreign influence. That's ridiculous. It's not foreign influence. That is actually ideas that should be shared across borders and that they, in my opinion, don't have a right at all to stop.
So how do we call them out on it? You said that they're scared of civil society support.
Yes.
Well, how do we call them out on it? How does that?
Yeah, I think we have to call them out on human rights grounds. So the way that authoritarians are arguing the case now is, well, I run the country, even though I don't hold free and fair elections, which is no problem for them to claim that. And I therefore get to assert sovereignty. And that means that I decide what happens in my own borders and you can't intervene. And that's their interpretation of international law. And it's ridiculous. I'll just poke two holes in it. First thing is where sovereignty comes from in a society is not the head of state, it's the people. That's where it lives. What gives the head of state the authority to represent those people is a process of self-determination, usually elections, where people say, we're going to give you our sovereignty for a certain amount of time so you can represent us. If a leader doesn't do that, doesn't renew their mandate, doesn't renew people's opportunity to freely give their sovereignty, what gives them the authority to assert sovereignty as if, they get to do that?
Right.
They don't. They're stealing it and taking it. And they're not entitled, in that case, to the same amount of sort of legitimacy for that claim. The second thing, if we accept the authoritarian interpretation of sovereignty, human rights are dead. And yet, if you look in human rights instruments, you will not find them saying, here are all these rights, except if it violates sovereignty. That is not how this works. If they meant to say that, they would say it in the treaties. They don't say it in the treaties. Human rights exist, sovereignty exists, and sometimes they conflict. And we have to argue that, we have to work with that, but we should not immediately defer to sovereignty on when human rights are being violated at all, or else truly we will give up on human rights and the autocrats will functionally make them dead.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
Yes, I have lots.
Okay, I'm not supposed to bring in you guys yet, so can you keep it? Yeah? Remember it, write it down. Okay, Aya, do you want to go next? And welcome.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to connect today. So my name is Aya Badarni. I'm from Jordan, and I'm leading several peace-building grassroots initiatives. And I come from a country where even the basic civil rights are not fulfilled. I mean, in every parliamentary round of voting, the percentage of voting is less than 23%. So I'm taking you all a step back. And my question would be, what are good ways to raise the youth awareness to, actively participate and understand the democratic values and their importance.
I don't know. I would consider you more an expert than me. I mean, for me, rule number one, if I want to organize people or if I simply want to help them, is listen, right? So, like, try to do as, I mean, this is not a creative suggestion. I have no special insight here, but try to listen as much as possible to the sources of dissatisfaction. What are people unhappy about? It may have nothing to do really with democracy on the surface. It may have to do with very specific things like the price of food or whatever. But we have to start with people where they are. And if what's real in their daily lives are, you know, corrupt police or whatever it is, it's very tangible. It's very real. It's where politics intersects with their life. That's where we need to start to speak to them. When we start to organize on those issues, we can begin to link it to bigger issues. Yes, the corruption you face when you try to get a permit or when you try to do this is actually the corruption faced by people in communities all over this country. Or the reason the fuel is so high, did you know who's getting rich from that? And do you know why? And don't you think a law should be passed? Why is a law not being passed? So the process of engaging is a process of taking the local and starting to draw those connections, but it takes time. And a lot of times, if we start with something that doesn't feel tangible and real to people, it doesn't land. Like right now, even in the United States, where we have challenges in our democracy, people are like, is democracy actually like landing and like connecting with people when we talk about protecting democracy in the United States? Or do we need to be like, no, like we need better income distribution? And like that's the thing that is going to connect better with people. But then can we also then connect that to democracy? And so I think it's different in every society, it's different in every context, it's different in every population. But that's just generally where I start. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you agree, Aya? Do you have?
Thank you very much.
Great. All right, Ronnie, do you have a question? I know Ronnie somewhere where connection might be bad.
Yeah.
Hey.
Hi. Almost nearing good morning here in my location. It's around 11:51 p.m. But yeah, I'm really happy to join this conversation. Not really a question, but probably like a secondment to the facts that our resource speaker have shared. We have also a historical, let's say this experience back here in the Philippines from shifting from a very democratic country now. We've experienced also a backslash from being an authoritarian now heading towards that as well. I mean, there's a consistency, there's a specific trend, and looking back at the history as well, it also shows more like the same trend, and well, it's also disappointing to see facts that there are a lot of discredits that are happening despite the real facts, that these things are really improper and etiquette, and it's not really into a good way of governance. But people in the democratic side now is how to say this, outnumbered, following. Yeah, I can just probably the reason is that the use of democracy has been being so long, and sometimes people get frustrated because it has been recorded really well of not sustaining some of the gains and some of these opportunities that the flight for democracies has been specifically in the Southeast Asia. Well, I'm not going to delve very clearly or specifically on some matters, but probably now I'm coming up with a particular question. Is there in the study? I haven't read much of it, but is there a trend that we need to put some caveat that these historical trends are happening again, or do we need to really put some indicators that we're expecting the same trend of from very democratic and now coming back from an authoritarian? type of environment. Yeah, I think that's it.
Great. Thank you. I think that the trends change partly because we make them change. Just because we're like swinging back in the autocratic direction, I do not think that means we're going to swing back in the democratic direction unless we make it swing that way. I mean, I do think over time, autocrats start to burn themselves out, but they will keep at it as long as they can. And so it's up to us to try to push them back as much as we can as well. Yeah, and I think you mentioned also like about sort of democratic backsliding, and I think I talked about 2 reasons why, but I mean there's so many. I mean, in many places, what is sold to people as democracy is a system that has significant corruption, that has problems that really aren't of fundamental fairness in people's lives, where it's not delivering. And again, that can be a major factor in backsliding. And what's interesting is that then people claim it's democracy's fault. Well, if this is democracy, then democracy doesn't work. I think part of what is important if you're trying to fight for democracy is say, actually, this democracy isn't working. You're right. The solution to this isn't to get rid of it. It's actually to make it better. It's actually to strengthen it, not get rid of it. The problem is not that we have too much democracy. It's actually that we don't have enough. Because democracy is about a lot more than elections. Democracy is about accountability. Democracy is about the presence of rights that are respected. Democracy is actually about rules that are fairly applied. Democracy is about civil society. The way that democracy sort of dies is when autocrats continue to say, oh, well, I hold elections, so I'm still democratic. There are lots of places that hold elections and aren't democratic. So we have to expand the public's concept of what democracy is as something that's much more than just about elections. It's about accountability. It's about, again, rights. It's about civil society. It's about rule of law. It's all of those things packaged together is what makes it work. If a bunch of those things are missing, it's not really full democracy. And we shouldn't allow people to conclude, oh, if that's democracy, I don't like it. No, let's make it better.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone online. Well, you can still ask questions, but now I'm thinking, because I know a lot of you have questions, so I'm thinking we should open up to the rest of you. And we'll start in here on site, and then we'll take a digital question and we'll go that way. And you'll keep track on Zoom, and I'll try to keep track here. So great. I'll start with you. Okay. So please speak up and let us know on Zoom if you can't hear us. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much. I was a bit late. I had an exhibition earlier on. So my question would be, probably you mentioned it, but first on my list of questions would be, where are you getting those statistics? Which context are you drawing them from? Especially with regards to whether nonviolent methods work or not. You mentioned some really interesting statistics, the 51% success rate, and also the 22% success rate for the violent ones.
26.
Oh yeah, 26, yes. So from which context is this coming from? Is it like a global one, or it's more of an American context?
Yes.
Then the second one would be, that being said, I'm from Zimbabwe, and we have tried a lot of these nonviolent methods, because if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, Zimbabwe is one of the most peaceful, trying to not use violent methods.
Yes.
But in all the cases, we have failed as a country, up until we had the coup not coup, as they call it. But then we also had the intervention from the US, where the first thing that they did was to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe, and followed by then the US giving us the US dollar to use as a currency, because Zimbabwe itself doesn't have a currency on its own. So right now, the Zimbabwean dollar is on 200% inflation, which means we depend more on the US. So, of which the sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe by the US, they were imposed on the government so they say. But if you look at who is suffering now, it's the people who are supposed to then be the ones forming these movements to actually come up with solutions for themselves. So how do you see that working, given an African context? Because I know a lot of the other countries in Africa also are going through the same. We look at South Africa, where they are fighting almost every day. Now South Africans engaging in the xenophobia or Afrophobia, not being happy with the situation. But looking at it in general, because from my understanding, we never had democracy in Africa. What happened was we had the Look East policy where, sorry to say this, but then we had white saviorism, where a lot of those Western countries came into Africa and then they were like, you need democracy. And then they introduced democracy. But then the way it was introduced was in such a way that it overturned tables in a lot of things. Yes. So in schools, they're like, children have rights, they're not supposed to be punished, kids don't deserve corporal punishment, and all those children's rights. Yeah. But then this then created this whole turn of tables where now the kids are radical in school because they can't be beaten, they can't be given punishments. And so how do you see this whole concept of democracy from an African perspective, given all this turning of tables that's coming through, these whole students trying to push for their well-being, but then in return or in response, I remember in 2019 when I was in Zimbabwe, there was a whole program from Norway where they were looking at students who are political victims, giving them scholarships and asylums to actually go to Norway, and then leaving Zimbabwe with no one to actually be on the forefront. So how does this work with the constant interventions from the West? I'm not saying it's bad. Yeah. It's good in a way, we have been exposed, but also I feel like that intervention is what is causing the backslide, which we don't have because we never experienced democracy to this stage. So, yeah.
Great ending to your question.
Thank you for your question. I'll start with the easy part, the stats.
Okay.
So a lot of the big findings I'm showing you are looking at a global context, and they're looking at, again, movements that are trying, technically, I'll give you the academic term, they're looking at movements that are trying to achieve maximalist objectives. Technically, these are three different kinds of objectives. Trying to get either A, political transition, new government, B, self-determination, actually secede from the country, or C, expel a foreign occupier. All of these represent a political transition of some sort. So whether it's talking about trying to get a political transition, that's what I mean. So actually, you can break it down into those three categories. Part of why they're studying that is because the view is those are really, really hard, big things to achieve. So let's test to see if movements can achieve that. And if they can achieve that, then maybe we can assume they can achieve lots of other smaller things as well. And so I think we don't have as much data on sort of reform-based movements, anti-corruption movements, movements that are not trying to get a change of government, but are trying to get certain kinds of rights. And I'm not sure always that those movements have it easier. And sometimes they might have it easier, but their challenge is still very complex. So I think, I'm drawing from the data that I have. A lot of it is national, but it is global. And plenty of it is actually, particularly in recent decades, a lot of cases from Africa, actually. So that's one. And this is freely downloadable online too, and you can look at the footnotes and citations in it. And then to look at the source data. In terms of US sanctions or other sanctions, so like the research on broad sanctions gives me a lot to be cautious about, right? So some research finds that if you threaten sanctions, you actually can drive up mobilization because people feel like, oh, the international community is paying attention. Let's mobilize. Interestingly, once the sanctions are imposed, the mobilization goes down again. So that's one. The other thing is that broad sanctions, as you pointed out, can do great harm. They can do great harm in lots of ways. They can hurt the civilian population and lead to humanitarian crises. They can give the dictator something to blame for the dictator's poor performance. They can get people preoccupied with meeting their daily life needs, and so they're not engaged in activism. They can make it harder for international supporters to get support in because now they're worried about violating sanctions if they send something. So there's lots of reasons why broad economic sanctions don't always work and can be negative. There are examples where they have, like the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. The movement actually asked, please sanction the white apartheid government. Even though it will hurt us, it will hurt them more. And like, I think a lot of people believe that that helped. And I think it probably did in South Africa. But in general, unless a population is really asking for broad sanctions, it's really questionable whether the international community should be imposing it. As an alternative, there are targeted sanctions. And I have more confidence in targeted sanctions on specific human rights abusers, specific companies. They're in some ways harder to do, and they require coordination. But I have more confidence that that's probably a better way to go most of the time. And then every kind of effort to help has risk. There's a reason why in my career for over 21 years doing this, it's only now that I wrote something to help with this. Because for a long time, I thought governments there's too much risk for them to try to help. On the other hand, the status quo is not okay either. Autocrats are ganging up on movements, and too many democratic governments that might be helpful are not prepared. And so really, we do have to push our governments to do more. There's ways they can mess it up in so many ways. You named one of them, like taking really talented people and giving them incentives to leave the country, and then maybe they don't come back. That's just one of them, right? There's so many ways they can do wrong. But governments aren't the only player. There's, non-governmental organizations, diaspora populations can be critically important. I don't have all the answers with regards to what the perfect approach is. I think, though, we need to be engaging in active conversation with recognition that at the end of the day, what's most important is people on the ground in that country. And the external community should be thinking, okay, they're the lead strategy. How can we support them? How can we listen to them? What do they need? How can we be an extension of their strategy rather than try to get in front and substitute for it, which simply doesn't work in my view. Yeah.
That's interesting. Mm-hmm. And now in my capacity working with like a Migunden, where the Global External Relations and Advocacy Officer, we're trying to come up with this approach where we look at how we maximize on local or indigenous knowledge in trying to create these movements that you mentioned. They don't happen overnight, but it's something that grows over time. Yeah. So we have introduced what's called social audit, which looks at, giving literacy skills to the community to understand their rights, but then moving forward, how then do they demand accountability from government officials and stakeholders to actually look beyond them waiting for aid. So we're looking at what's called reframing aid, which could also be interesting if I then get to read your book.
Sure. Great. Yeah. Let me also say one other thing too, like with regards to Zimbabwe in particular, a country that I've followed as closely as I can. And when you say we've tried this nonviolent organizing, I know you have. I've seen it. And it's an unsatisfying answer. A few things. In spite of the frustration, all the research tells us that a shift in tactics towards violence as an alternative would be disastrous. That's not satisfying, but unfortunately, this was research tells us. The second thing, though, is in situations where activists, I think one of the most powerful things we can do, like one methodology I might use working with activists isn't say, look, I'm not going to tell you anything. I don't know what you should do. What I'm going to do is I know that there's some basic attributes that help movements succeed. The first one is unity. Another one is strategic planning and building out sort of a strategic capacity. This means lots of people are trained in strategic planning for this movement. A third is commitment to nonviolent discipline, nonviolent means. A fourth is the ability to get mass participation across ethnic groups, across age groups, across various demographics, urban, rural, you name it. A fifth is the ability to make repression backfire. When violence is done against us, that we have allies or ways that we can make it really costly to the people who are doing the violence. And then the sixth is actually the ability to get defections from our opponent supporters. Those 6 things, when movements have those, they're extremely powerful. So I say to the movement, I don't know what you should do, but can you rank how you're doing on those 6 things? And if there are some areas where you find gaps, Can we zoom in and brainstorm now on how we can fill those gaps? I want it to only come from you activists. Brainstorm it. Okay, we've generated 20 ideas. Great. Why don't you all identify what the 3 most promising ideas are? Now, if we go through that process, and by the end of that process, people have nothing, I have nothing either. But so far, we've never gone through that process where people didn't generate really good ideas and then start to work on them. And so that's sort of one way I think about working with movements when they feel really stuck.
That's very concrete for a very broad question. Thank you. Do we have a question?
We do have one.
Great.
Online.
And then we have one on site as well.
Yeah, and someone also raised their hand. But I think I'll take the one that's written here. So this is from Aaron Bala from Liberia in West Africa, who also thanks us for the presentation. And I'll read his question. My country is a country that is well known for corruption by public and government officials. What are some strategies that you people can use to engage their leaders in government? That's all.
Around corruption.
Liberia.
Yes.
And his question was about corruption in the public and by public and government officials.
Mm-hmm.
And then what are some strategies that people can use to engage their leaders in government?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are a bunch. There's a great book out, which is available for free online. It's called Curtailing Corruption. You search it, you should be able to find it. It's for free. It's actually on our website. You can download it for free. And what it has is, I think, maybe 14 different case accounts of anti-corruption movements. One movement, for example, is a movement in Sicily, in Italy, where people are organizing actually against the mafia. Another one is in, I believe, India, where people are organizing against corruption among civil servants and getting driver's licenses, permits, that kind of thing. Another one is in South Korea, where people are organizing against corrupt parliamentarians. Another one is in Kenya, where people are organizing around making sure that development funds are spent responsibly. And then there's others. These movements are brilliant. I can't summarize all of them right now, and I don't have them all in my head, but I'm telling you that some of the examples that we've learned from all over the world about how to confront corruption through community mobilization, nonviolent action, really smart tactics, I've learned so much from those activists. So I guess I would say possibly think checking out the book since it's for free. And just to give a few examples, in India, there was a campaign called the Zero Rupee campaign, they called it Fifth Pillar. And the Fifth Pillar campaign had a tactic called the Zero Rupee note. What they did is the activists would agree, they'd basically pledge together, I will neither give nor accept any bribes. And we're all going to work together in making sure we don't do this. Don't take, give, or accept bribes. So then when a bureaucrat asked for a bribe, they would literally hand them a piece of paper that looked like a rupee, like a currency, except it's a zero. And on it says, I will not accept or give any bribes. And then the bureaucrat would realize this person's never going to give me what I want. And this person is also supported by other people who are going to possibly protest and do other things. And what they would do if they didn't get their way is they would file these freedom of information, right to information requests from the government on the status of, what's the status of my business permit? What's the status of my driver's license? Who's holding it up? Who's the name? They would constantly push for accountability. They would train people on how to file these requests under Indian law to keep getting more information. Why is this being held up? And eventually they changed the psychology of the people who were wanting bribes to be like, okay, I'll just give you what you want because I can see this is going to be too painful for me if I try to get a bribe out of you. They also did things like they found out the actual cost under law for services, and they started publicizing them. Because if you went to the bureaucracy, the bureaucrat would say, oh, that's going to cost X. It didn't cost X. That's just what they said because they wanted some of the money. What it actually cost was what the law said, and they started posting publicly, this is what things actually cost. So there's some very basic but quite brilliant stuff like that people have used in many different contexts. So again, check out the book. if you can. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Okay, so we'll go with you. Then we have two more. Yes.
Yeah, I'll try to make my question as brief as possible. I mean, like a lot of the things I think both you and the lady here, you've already touched on a bit of what I was thinking of. And I'll try to term it as a foreign implicitness. You know, like a lot of these leaders, I'll talk about Africa because I'm from Africa. And a lot of leaders, if you look at it in an African context, maybe from an African level, where a lot of African presidents don't really have what we call maybe a peer review, where they would see what their fellow leaders are doing and where they can advise them. And I'll give an example of Zimbabwe itself. When Zimbabwe's economy was really down, and the African Union gladly accepted $1 million from Robert Mugabe, despite the unemployment rate being very high. And you go to, I think it was Guinea Conakry when I think it was in France, there was a church that was broken down, and despite having 65% unemployment rate, the president still donated 20 million euros. And none of the leaders would see that these are the things that would make like the people like these things which probably encourage lack of accountability, because they are misusing all the funds and the leaders are saying it, but they're not trying to do anything to correct it. And if you jump across the sea, if you come to the Western world, if you see a lot of leaders when they steal, and they come and invest the money, they invest the money in France, they invest the money in London, they invest in America. And a lot of authorities know this money is probably stolen money, but they turn a blind eye.
Yes.
And then now when things come up, like it's happening in West Africa, and now the people are rising up, a lot of coup d'etats, and now that's when you find these regional organizations and international organizations say, oh yeah, now we need to send in a security force to go and correct the situation to bring democracy. But my question is, shouldn't democracy also be that those leaders should be accountable to their population as well, to their voters? So like when they're stealing from their population and getting all the resources out of them, misusing it, like the international community almost pays a blind eye. And then when the population reacts, that's when they try to react. Like, don't you see that that's probably one of the reasons that the movement now has the success rates of the nonviolent movements has fallen down.
Yes. Thank you for that comment. I mean, the international community has turned a blind eye in many cases. I think they're doing a little better now, but in many cases they have. The other thing is that the international democratic community needs to work much better together, right? So you're going to say, aha, targeted sanctions, you don't get the benefit of investing in the United States or whatever. Invest in the EU. Well, you need the EU to give the sanctions too. Well, then they can invest in Britain. Well, you need Britain to do it to invest in Canada. And so you see that the for sanctions regime to, if we're going to get past like broad economic sanctions and do targeted, especially, we have to have a level of cooperation among the democratic world, which is where a lot of these people want to invest their money. It's where they want to hide it. It's where they want to get medical treatment and so forth. It needs a much higher level of coordination, which is absolutely essential. I mean, we call for it in here. It's very important. I mean, the other half of helping movements is making autocrats' life harder, is imposing costs on them. So I completely agree with you that this is what should be done, and it's really what must be done. And it's, you know, it is an international coordination challenge that I think all of us should be pushing our governments to do better on. The other thing I would say is that where we can do better is we should be pushing more and more for civil society support on who to sanction and how to sanction, right? We should be seeking out people who understand how networks of corruption work, even if they're outside the governmental sector, and say, give us a list, we'll investigate it, work with them, we'll work with people, because we need as many eyes and ears as possible on how to do this well.
Thank you. We have a question from Zoom.
We have one more from Nathaly.
Go ahead, Nathaly.
Thank you. Thank you for really interesting questions and replies. I think that I just wanted to take with me a take on that I feel that I'm being inspired of how should we create grassroots movements and more stronger movements in Sweden, since I'm based in Sweden, but I also think that there's a lot of inspire from Guatemala, since I don't know if you know about the current context right now, but there's been an election and the Social Democrat Party have won the election, but it's been quite difficult for this party to actually have the transition, since there are being legal methods are being used for them to excuse them that they're not legitimate elected by the people. So I think you said something important, that you say that election is not democracy is not, it's not only about elections. And I think the case of Guatemala shows it really precisely, that you need accountability, you need rules that are fairly played, you need a civil society that are able to act it out. I mean, I think that is what I don't know, it's just reflection, but because I can see it so much in Guatemala, but I also see the resilience of the people, of constantly not giving up and still going to movements, still having manifestations. And right now they're actually blocking the streets so that transfer trails, big cars cannot pass. Sorry, I'm working in Spanish, so my brain is but I just think it's we can be so inspired of the moments that we are, where we work or where we're based, and bring it to our own place. And I feel that's my take, that I coming back to Sweden, I think that is what we need to do, not just see us as silos, the environmental movement or the this movement, but I think we need to work together and collaborate. And I also think you said it, so it's just more a reflection. I can't see the public in front of me, so it's talking with myself and with Maria and you, but it's just that I wanted to just share the reflection. And also, if you can have an eye on Guatemala right now, what is happening is quite interesting, also on how the civil society have responded, and how the people who are not been interested in democracy before are actually being engaged, and how social media also a weapon, or not a weapon, but it's also a tool for change. So TikTok has been used a lot here, for example, to be able for this party to win the first round and to come to the first round and to win in the second round. So yeah, I am there, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Nathaly.
Thank you. So we have a question from you. Go ahead and please speak up.
Okay. So thank you for an interesting discussion. So in your presentation, you touched slightly upon Milosevic. So I'm thinking that it goes back to the outpour and what happened there in the early 2000s. And based on this, and also connecting to the fact that they received aid from the United States, it kind of made me think, and I'm wondering, would you say there's a defining line when a regime becomes excessively autocratic in terms of when internal movements should receive this kind of external support? And I'm thinking, particularly taking into account the USA's very militaristic approach to, for example, the Ukraine conflict and Russia's and the very autocratic regime in Russia and the militaristic strategy. And also reflecting back to the fact that after war, there was another attempt for a Serbian non-resistance movement, but I can't remember the name of it. And I'm thinking there, if you can see some kind of how the external support and the value of this goes into phases, and if you've seen that in the research.
I think in terms of so if we ground international support in the human rights of the population receiving that support, then in one sense, it doesn't matter whether they're under a democratic government or not, in one sense, right? So it's our human rights. We have freedom of association. I have it in the United States. You have it in Sweden. You have it in Zimbabwe. or under law we're supposed to have it, then on the one hand you say there's certain kinds of support that anyone can get under any case. I think there are arguments you can make that as a government becomes more abusive and less accountable, sometimes it does open up new forms of support, because then you say, look, this government has no legitimate claim to sovereignty, so we can do more, right? So you can kind of come at it from both ways. I think, where is that line where you say, aha, the government can no longer claim to be sovereign? It's very tricky. It's very tricky because the process of transitioning from a democracy to an autocracy is not always a clear process. And by the way, we have more elections in the world right now than at any time in history, and yet autocracy is rising. So they don't get rid of elections, they keep them, making it even harder to figure out, well, are they autocratic yet or not? Or maybe are they in between? And it's very confusing for movements too, because we have elections. Should we rely on the elections? Should we not rely on the elections because we think they're fake? But it's really confusing. I do think that the international community as a whole has to do better at trying to draw red lines, because the current system is not working very well, where we're by the time we label a country and say, oh, that's really democratic backsliding in that country, so much damage has already happened. So we have to figure out what are the sort of key indicators we're going to look at. It's going to trigger some kind of reaction from us early on before things get too bad. But look, democracy is a very difficult concept to study, to define. There's lots of different aspects. There's lots of different judgments about what's more democratic or less. You can't assign a number to the human rights situation in any country, really, but people try because it's a way to study it. But all of it is about judgments, right? So we can do better, even while recognizing that we'll never get perfect on that. And then I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I fully answered your question, but that's it. Hopefully gets part of it. Was there another piece?
I think it's
okay. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We only have time for one more question. I know you raised your hands, and then we need to wrap up, unfortunately.
I'll make it quick. So I'm thinking, given that the world is becoming much more digitalized, given that we have this event in this shape and form, in terms of educating, alerting, mobilizing, is there any research on how movements are affected by digitalization?
Oof.
Apart from hashtags.
Technology and Oh, you've hit on one of my topics that yes, this is something that concerns me a lot. So it's possible to make the argument that technology was helpful or hurt depending on where you look and what time you looked at, right? So on one time, it seemed like social media was a liberation technology. And then in other places, it seems like the opposite. It seems like spyware, right? When she was used it, they're like, oh, I figured out your friends. Now I know who to arrest and who to spy on. And that changes over time, and it changes depending on the tech capacity there. So it's complicated. There are tons of studies on that. But I don't think the answers are really simple. I think we can gain insight, but I think context still matters a lot. So there's no sort of general rule. I'd say just a few general things though. I mentioned these sort of 6 attributes earlier: unity, planning, nonviolent discipline, mass participation, making repression backfire, and defections. That's the core of movement success as far as I'm concerned. If technology helps achieve those attributes, great. Technology will never be a replacement for those attributes. So when people ignore that and they're like, let's get mobilization and we can do it on social media, you can, but you're not going to win. Not if you rely on social media. You'll get mobilization, but you won't get organization. You won't get sustainability. Now, if you do a lot of planning, build your coalitions, do a lot of that work, social media could be a great tool for you once you've laid the foundation, so that when you mobilize, you're disciplined, you've got a clear strategy, it's targeted, it's clear. At the end of your mobilization, people have a sense of what they're doing next, right? So in this case, it's a tool. It's not a substitute. And I think that what social media does when used by activists sometimes is it diverts their attention to something that seems important, but it's not that important. So if I'm lacking confidence in what I'm doing, and I'm like, well, maybe I'll try nonviolent means, I'm going to try to find something quickly to show me that I'm doing well or not, because I don't really have confidence. So like, I need quick feedback for them. So likes, clicks, quick demonstrations seem like this really powerful thing. Oh, okay, it's working. I'll do that. Again, that's not the key to sustainability. It's actually distracting me from what I need to do, which is say, I need like to develop a 3 to 5 year plan here to grow slowly at first so that I can grow fast later on. And I think technology, when we put it in its proper context, can be powerful, but it needs to be in that context. On the other hand, governments are using technology incredibly effectively to be repressive. I think overall, right now, the conflict favors them in many cases with technology. When I talk with activists, I think be very careful about any technology you're going to depend on. Any technology you depend on potentially could be used to spy on you, potentially could be a vulnerability. If you depend on this app for your mobilization, what happens when that app doesn't work? And so we want to be very intentional and strategic in movement work about what tech we're going to use, understanding the risks, and understanding that even if we make a choice when we're small, if we still rely on it when we're big, it could be a real limitation to us if it gets taken away. And we have to kind of see it with all of that complexity and then use it where it's appropriate. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, I'm just really impressed with the complexity of your questions, and we got some really good answers as well. There's a lot of concrete information in this seminar, I think. And since we work with a lot of young people, and in particular in the Global Peace Hub, young peace builders, and what we do in the project is support the implementation of the UN Security Council resolution on youth, peace, and security, that acknowledges and states the importance of including youth all over the world in peace processes and decision making. And well, keeping that in mind, I would like to share from your publication, from your framing essay that was recently published, We Need People Power to Address a World in Peril. So I'd like to share part of the conclusion. Crises can overwhelm, but they can also focus the mind. They can exacerbate divisions, but they can also forge unity and shared purpose. They can lead to frustration and despair, but they can also lead to bold innovation and creativity. We must choose unity, focus, and innovation. They are the only viable options for a world worth protecting and fighting for. So with this conclusion, which ends on a positive note, which is basically stating as well that we don't have a choice. We have to go forward, and we want to go towards positivity. And very well, keeping in mind, in particular, our young peace builders and everyone who's active, and youth is such an important group as well, because demographically, they're such a large group in the world today. So do you have any ending words that what recommendation, like what message do you want to send out?
Don't ever believe that you're not powerful. Understand that those who want to stop you, they'll try to convince you that you're not powerful. They'll try to divide you. They'll try to confuse you. They'll try to make you feel hopeless. We can't give in to that. We don't have a choice. We must look. Every single movement that won started from a place where people said it probably won't work, and there was a lot of doubt. Now, I'm not trying to sit here and encourage you to be activists. Like, that's a deeply personal choice. That's your life. There is risk involved sometimes, depending on the context. It's not for me to encourage you to make those choices. Those are your personal choices to make. It is, however, for me to say that we all are powerful. It's important that we remember that, and that whatever we choose to do with our life does shape society. And if we do choose an activist route, we're choosing a hard path, but we're also choosing one of the most important paths we can choose. And it's important as activists to really educate ourselves as much as possible about what we're doing strategically. If you wanted to become a soldier, you could sign up and get training. If you wanted to become an attorney and you could afford school, you could train to become a lawyer. If you wanted to become an engineer and could afford school, and you could become an engineer and design bridges. If you say, I want to be a better activist and organizer, society basically says you're on your own. It's a tough path. But it is something, there's a lot of knowledge out there that we can get better. We need to be students of learning or students of lessons wherever we can find them. And historically, activists have started with little and achieved a lot. And I think that's part of the hope that we have now, is that ordinary people are fighting back. They will continue to fight back. We need to help to make sure people can do that as skillfully and as effectively as possible. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone for participating today. It's been great. And I loved the questions and the answers. Thank you to Aya, Nathaly, and Ronnie, and Abhishek, who participated, and everyone else on Zoom. And thank you everyone in the room. And most of all, thank you, Hardy, for coming to Sweden to join us for this discussion. It's been great to have you.
Thanks, everyone.